Hello, I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to our community forum on threats to civic engagement. I'm Marianne Vega Clancy, the president of our local League of Women Voters of North County, San Diego. The League is over 100 years old. We were founded after the passing of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women the right to vote. We are a strictly nonpartisan grassroots organization. Our mission then, as now, is to educate and empower voters and defend democracy. Tonight's topic addresses threats to civil discourse. So I'll start by asking you, what is civility? Your grandmother may have told you to mind your P's and Q's. This is an origin of this phrase I think is very interesting as a sidebar, but we won't go into it. Civil behavior is more than just good manners, of course, more than just please and thank you. It's courtesy, respect, and listening to others. We were taught to say that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, when we were taunted as children. But we've always known that words can indeed hurt. And moreover, words can lead not just to fear, but anger and even physical violence. In California, it is illegal to threaten a public official with death or serious bodily injury. But despite this law, and despite the possibility of significant legal consequences, the number of threats to elected officials locally and on the national level as well has been escalating. Tonight you will hear from Rachel Locke, an extremely accomplished individual who has made an impact on people and governments locally, nationally, and even internationally. Sadly, Dr. Carl Luna could not attend this evening, but Director Rachel Locke, who spoke to us last year and has since continued her research with Dr. Luna, will tell you more about more recent research. We will also hear from Stephen Marquardt, Chief Special Operations Division of the San Diego District Attorney's Office, who will offer insights into prosecutorial capacities when it comes to threats and harassment of local officials. We are further pleased to have Daniel Orth and his colleagues from the National Conflict Resolution Center here to help facilitate our table dialogues and to share with us a bit more of their work bringing people together, including areas of disagreement and conflict. Last, I would like to recognize our gratitude to an organization seeking to help diverse local partners collaborate to make the San Diego region a better place for all of us to live, work, and play. The Burnham Center for Community Advancement, through whose help tonight's program is made possible. So please join me now in welcoming Tad Parzan from the Burnham Center, who will provide further welcoming remarks and help us kick off this evening's program.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As a language nerd, I'm super curious. I want to know about the P's and Q's. I always thought it was pints and quarts. Like, pay attention to how much, just pay attention. So thank you again, and thank you to League of Women Voters and NCRC and the DA's office and CROC IPJ, for your wonderful collaboration on this event and many others on which we work. I work with all of these agencies in different contexts. In particular, one that lines up nicely with our moment in history. I just happened to be listening to President Biden's speech on the way up, and he was talking about our moment in history. I've been doing a lot of reflection on where we are and what we need to do. We call ourselves at the Burnham Center a think and do tank, because we can't do all the thinking, and the thinking is important. Like Simon Sinek always talks about, start with the why. So we work in a sequence that goes like this: ideate, organize, and activate. That activate is critical. We can be in rooms like this. This is the important ideation part, but then we got to get organized and we got to go do something. And if there was ever a time in my life, other than the 60s perhaps, where I was a child on the south side of Chicago and got to witness firsthand the power of organized people to make the world a better place, that was it, and it inspired me throughout my life to do the work that I do now. So I feel like we're in a moment kind of like the greatest generation, and we have the opportunity to be perhaps the next greatest generation to meet the challenge of the moment. When I think about what they did, the hundreds of thousands of people that enlisted, women that had been marginalized previously enlisted and went to work in factories, Tuskegee Airmen, black folks that had been really marginalized for quite some time throughout our history, stepped up and were critical in the war effort. The Native American code talkers who had been run off their land, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they stepped up to make a critical difference in the war effort. So I really liken this time to that time. So it's up to us, and conversations like this are where it starts. This is where we figure out what we need to do, and then we get organized and do it. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to all the participants and League of Women Voters for putting this on. We're delighted to be here and be part of this very important conversation at a critical moment in our nation's history. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen Marquardt, who has a really tough job over at the DA's office, and I'm sure he's going to have some illuminating remarks to help us understand how the mechanics of dealing with public meetings and other public scenarios gets harder and harder every day. Stephen?
And thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It is such an important topic, and I am really impressed to see that there is such a positive, great turnout for tonight's events. I am with the District Attorney's Office. My role in the office led by the great Summer Steffen, who many of you may know, always putting victims first, always focused on the safety of the community for all. I'm in a unit that is kind of behind the scenes, but that goal of ensuring the safety of all and making sure that we all feel comfortable going about our daily life is critical to what I do. I am the chief of the Special Operations Division. When people think of the District Attorney's Office, oftentimes they think of a gangs prosecution or drugs prosecution or domestic violence prosecution or sex crimes prosecution, and all of the more traditional, well-known, in the courtroom every day sort of divisions. Special operations sounds very vague, and a lot of what we do is very critical to a well-functioning society and to our local communities. One of the things we do is we handle hate crimes prosecutions. So all hate crimes that take place around the county come to my division. We have specialized prosecutors who focus on that, who have partnerships with many organizations and law enforcement agencies throughout the county. We also go out and do a lot of training for the community on that front. We also deal with public corruption, public integrity. So if there are government officials who are committing fraud or some sort of misdeed, it is my division that investigates that with a highly specialized team of investigators and will prosecute those government officials. We also review officer-involved shootings and other conduct by law enforcement officers. So if there is a question about whether an officer did something inappropriately, it is placed in my division where, again, we have a very experienced team of former law enforcement who are district attorney investigators, prosecutors who have gone through a lot of training to analyze these to make sure that every person in the community can have confidence in the system, that regardless of where you're coming from or who you are represented and you are protected. For purposes of tonight, the critical part that my unit also handles is threats against government officials, threats against judges, threats against elected people, threats against people who are parts of school boards. And it has been very disheartening to see the number of these threats go up and up with time. I think a large part of that is the anonymity that a lot of people feel today because, turn back the clock 20 years, and if you were going to insult somebody, I don't know, maybe you had to send them a letter in the mail, maybe you had to call them on the phone and hang up, that maybe that was about the best you can do, but really you had to say it face to face. And when you have to say something face to face, there are consequences, right? There's a dialogue. Someone can respond to you. You have to be able to stand your ground and defend your words. We live in an era where it seems many people have become emboldened, whether it's through the anonymity or through seeing other figureheads or other people insulting, and they are following that lead. It is very impressive to see all of the work that has gone into quantifying this, putting this into statistics, because in my work, we receive complaints and concerns from all sorts of elected officials, from mayors of different municipalities to school board members and everywhere in between. And to see the work here really helps us to have a better understanding of how to proceed and how to handle this. With the amount increasing in threats and intimidation, a lot of times people that I meet and talk to about some of the work that my unit does say, well, who's being prosecuted? What's happening? And so I wanted to explain so that everybody here has an understanding of what the law allows us to do from a prosecutorial perspective and what it doesn't allow. Obviously, we live in a country that is based on freedoms. We have the First Amendment, and most speech is protected by the First Amendment. That can include insulting people. That can include derogatory remarks about different people or different groups of people. That can include putting a big sign or banner on your own property. That can include oftentimes distributing leaflets that are very offensive, whether it be sexist, racist, anti a certain religious or ethnic group, homophobic, anything like that. So a lot of times those are protected by the First Amendment. However, that doesn't mean that as a well-functioning, diverse community and society, we should tolerate those things. It is important that we as citizens condemn activity when we see it. Even if it may be allowed by the law, that does not necessarily mean that it has a positive impact on the community. What I mean by that is I hold dear the protections that we have, and I think they're extremely important, and I'm so happy that we have them. But there are very specific things that we need to show if we are going to file a criminal case against somebody. In California, there are a few specific penal code sections that we have as tools that we can hold somebody accountable. One of those is criminal threats. But there are many different what we call elements that we are required to prove to a court in order to file a criminal charge against somebody for that crime. We have to demonstrate that the person willfully threatened to either kill or cause great bodily injury to somebody. So it has to be a pretty extreme sort of threat in the first place. We also have to be able to prove that it was actually communicated. So it can't just be inferred or something that somebody gathers just by the mood of things. There actually has to be some form of communication. Also has to be shown that the person who made the statement intended that it be taken as a threat. We also have to be able to demonstrate that the person who received the threatening words was actually in fear for themselves. And not just momentary, fleeting fear. It has to be a sustained fear, something that lasts for a while. So if somebody says something upsetting to you, and you're momentarily upset by it, that's not a crime. That's protected speech. And it's great that we live in a society where we all have the ability to speak freely. But in order to cross the line and be prosecuted, we have to show all of those things. And we also have to show that the fear that the person was in was reasonable. So if somebody is afraid because someone says, I'm going to set loose a herd of elephants to stampede you, and they are afraid by that, well, that's probably not very reasonable. So there are a lot of things that we receive as complaints from the community, from government officials, from the police, that we cannot prosecute, but we document it. and we are able to review it, make contact with the victim, give supportive services, offer counseling, and oftentimes that's free. There's a lot of different support mechanisms that we can provide. It's also important if one person has made some sort of threat that we cannot file in a case, that we become aware of it, because it's possible that person is doing it elsewhere. And when we start to see a pattern, that's when it becomes, some of these gray areas become more easy for us to prove. Another common question we have is, why can't you file a charge against somebody for stalking? And again, stalking has a very specific enumerated list of things that we have to prove. Several of them are some of the ones that we just went over, that there's actually a threat there, that there's repeated or intentional harassment, that the person intended to frighten the person, and that the person was in reasonable fear. So there are all of these different elements. And what we often find is somebody is going to say they were just blowing off steam. They didn't actually intend to carry out the threat. They just were insulting somebody. And if under the circumstances that's reasonable, that's a case we cannot file. But again, we can take note of it, we can offer services, and we can have that in a record for future instances. Threatening a public official. That also has many of the same requirements, except the person also has to know that the person is a public official. They have to intend that the public official take their words as a threat, not just as an insult, not just as a derogatory comment, not just, I disagree with your point of view and I think you should X, Y, Z. They have to expect that the person takes it as a threat, the person actually has to take it as a threat, and it has to be clear that the person who made the threat has the apparent ability to carry it out. So there are so many technicalities here that we have to demonstrate. And really, I think that that's a good thing because it protects all of our speech. In a lot of these laws, we're not written in an area of social media and anonymity. And it is hard to keep up with the law, or hard to keep up with the changes in society, that is. However, what that says to me, though, is that the most important thing that all of us can do, again, as I said in the beginning, just because something is protected by the law doesn't mean that it necessarily is going to have a positive effect on us, the individual words that somebody says. If we document these things, if we report them, if we are able to tabulate them, we can help to make sure that this doesn't turn into something else. Oftentimes we see these harassing statements start out as something low level, and then it escalates. And if somebody has the sense that they are not going to be vindicated, not going to be protected by the law, they may not go forward and file a case. They may not go forward and report it to the police. They may not go forward and let the district attorney's office know about it. But it is critical that if somebody feels that they are in danger, even if it doesn't meet all of these elements, it is critical that it be reported because we conduct additional investigation. There are different things that we do behind the scenes to determine, is this a threat that the person intended to carry out? Just because somebody has an interaction, a government official has an interaction with somebody at a city council meeting, for example, and they hear some threatening words, that's in a vacuum. And while on its face that might not meet all of those elements, if that's reported to us, we can look back and maybe this person has a history of making threats against other people. Maybe this person has had restraining orders taken out against them by other people. And we can use those pieces of evidence to support what happened there in the city council meeting, because we can show that this is a person who has intimidated people in the past. This is a person who understands the power of their words. This is not a person who is just letting off steam. This is somebody who has been, restrained in different situations. So I want to make it abundantly clear that you may not see as many prosecutions as you would expect living in the area that we live in. That is because we have laws that are very, very specific about what can be filed in court. And again, that is a great thing on the level that we all have the freedom of speech. It doesn't mean that we cannot pursue a case. What it means is that we have to really separate out just the bothersome, upsetting language that's protected from the people who are actually threatening us. And to do that, it is very important things be reported so they can be investigated, because we can look into the background, we can look into the totality of the circumstances and determine if there's something we can do. Ultimately, though, if you know of somebody who has been harassed, who has been threatened, and we tell this to all sorts of people, including government officials, another very critical point that I just want to make clear, going back to how we started out, is that victim safety is at the forefront of our minds in every situation. And even if we cannot file a criminal case against somebody, there are different resources we can provide. There's different support we can provide. There are coordinated efforts we can have with our other law enforcement partners in order to make sure that a community feels safe. There's education that we can do. There are events like this so that we can just go out and let the community know that we are taking these things seriously. We are behind the scenes working on these to try to make sure that the number is brought down, and we are trying to distinguish between what is just somebody blowing off steam and it's really not going to cause any harm, and that is their right, and when is somebody actually in threat, and then when do we need to step it up with our law enforcement partners and take action and hold that person accountable. So with that overview of the law and how some of our investigative tactics work, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to talk about the statistics of their studies.
Thanks. Yep.
Can you take some questions before you go to statistics based on what you just said?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I don't mean to interrupt you, Rachel. My name is Anna Pedros. I'm the VP of HR here.
Okay.
And I'm elected official at Marquardt College. I'm a board member there, right? And so I want to make sure that I heard you correctly. And I want us to make sure that we're sending the right message, right? When somebody feels threatened or hears a threat, what I believe I heard you said was there's different things that have to be checked off, right? As in everything. Does the person have the ability or the intention to hurt that person? That victim at that point is likely not to know that.
Absolutely.
So they need to report.
They should. Absolutely.
Right? And then it's your role to determine that.
Yes. So if somebody is threatened, if somebody makes a harassing, threatening comment, it is critical that it be reported. Because, exactly your point, that's a great point. Thank you. There is so much that the person who is confronted is not going to be aware of, which is partly why this is so troubling. It can be such a frightening experience because you don't know who this person is. You don't know if this person has threatened other people or actually has committed crimes. You don't know if this person has just had a bad day, but you shouldn't make that decision or try to make that evaluation. You should report it, not only so that you can be supported, but so that that situation can be investigated. And so, because, and I apologize, Rachel, I just want to, this is an important point, so let me just say it. It is about the person who is being threatened. Absolutely, we want to support the victim, but it is also about who has come before and who is going to come after. If there is somebody who is out there who is behaving in this way, it is important that that be evaluated. We can't evaluate it if, you brush it off and say, well, that person has a problem. Because they may really have a problem, and they may do this again to somebody else. So as a community, again, while it is important that whether we know all of those elements or not, that we as a community protect each other and support each other and report it so that a proper investigation can be conducted and the appropriate parties, law enforcement, mental health services, whoever it may be, because some of these people may be referred to mental health services. It's not always also just about prosecution. It's about assisting people so that they can get on their feet and make sure that this is something that's taken out of the equation under which we all have to operate.
Thanks, Stephen. Just to note, Stephen, I believe, is staying throughout the course of the evening. So if there are more questions for him, please do take note of them, and I'm sure that he will avail himself to you once we break into groups or afterwards. So my name's Rachel Locke. I direct the Violence, Inequality and Power Lab at the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego. Yes, I know it's a mouthful. I started doing this research 2 years ago with the team at Kroc IPJ, as well as with Dr. Carl Luna for the Institute for Civil Civic Engagement, because we really just wanted to understand the scope of the problem here locally. We started last year just analyzing San Diego County, and we expanded this year in 2024 to Riverside and Imperial Counties. So I'm going to speak with you tonight about our findings from the research, implications from all three counties. I will touch a little bit on San Diego because we're in San Diego County, but it is a 3-county initiative. Before I do, some of you joined us last year at the Public Library in Encinitas when we had a briefing of our results last year. At that event, we also had, I believe, Summer Stefan actually was there and spoke, as Stephen did, about the law. It's so crucial to know what Stephen has provided as overview of prosecutorial capacity and what is possible and what is not. It's also really important, and this is what I'm going to talk about, to understand that the effects of threats and harassment are massively wide-ranging beyond the remit of what the law says in terms of our democracy, our communities, how we engage with one another, and how we govern the shared space that we all hold dear. So much of what I'm going to focus on are those bigger questions, right, of local governance and democratic engagement, but we have to be grounded in the law as well, which is why we always invite a lawyer to these conversations. Huge thank you to everyone who's at the table, but really huge thank you to the League of Women Voters North County, who did such a massive organizing effort for this conversation. You are going to hear from me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our findings, and then we're going to go into table discussions where you will come up with the solutions that are going to save our democracy here in Southern California. So get ready. We have notepads. We can get you more. There's 2 screens. So for those of you in the back, if this screen is difficult for you to see, please feel free to shift your chairs and focus on this one. And with that, can we go to the next slide, please? I don't have a clicker, so my colleague Ioli, who's back here, will be helping to advance the slides. I'm going to run through the background, also the state that we're in as a country and a community right now. Very quickly touch on our methods and our data sources, then get to the interesting stuff, our findings, and who particularly is affected by this phenomenon of threats and harassment. And then we'll talk next steps, and then we'll move you into solutions. So next slide, please. This is a quote from a very recent article in The Atlantic, talking about political violence that is, in many cases, highly predictable. So there are some forms of violence that are harder to predict, although as someone who studies violence, I would say most forms of violence are in many ways predictable. Political violence is included in that. Often it sort of simmers for a long time, right? And we see instances of it here and there, but then it grows. And once you reach a certain inflection point, it's hard to put back in the bottle, if you will. We've reached that inflection point in this country. And one of the signifiers, one of the markers is this intensifying demonization, this othering that happens by certain people against other people, often based on political opinions or beliefs or identities, including partisan identities. So again, once this happens, it becomes difficult to reverse, not impossible, however, and so it's always really crucial to bear in mind that this is something that we all can do something about, but we actually have to all do something about it. We can't just passively observe it. Next slide, please. So, crucial. Nationally, we've seen a huge increase in threats and harassment across the country in 2023 and 2022. Before that as well, but those 2 years had a real significant spike. Half of all those who were surveyed, this data comes not from us, but from Bridging Divides Initiative, who does a lot of work on this topic nationally. They're based at Princeton. Half reported receiving insults, a third harassments, and roughly 20% were threatened. And threats are the highest level of those three categories, right? So 20% is pretty high. Women, 23% more likely. Minorities, 10% more likely to be harassed. 30% more likely to be threatened. So actual threats directed towards minorities at a much higher rate. The state of California, in a national comparison, had the highest number of unique incidents of threats and harassment of any when compared to any other state. Next slide, please. These are quotes. I'm going to be giving them throughout the presentation that we heard from elected officials here in Southern California and the 3 counties that we included in the survey to tell you how they feel about what's happening with threats and harassment. This bottom one is really poignant, I think, right? We hear about polarization in the country. We hear about people being at crosshairs with each other. This is playing out in your school boards and your city councils right here. Next slide, please. All the quotes are anonymous for obvious reasons. These are our sources and methods. So we did a mixed methods research study. We wanted to do surveys where people self-report. We also wanted objective data. So we looked at we did a social media review. We looked at traditional media. We also did some experiments, which I'll tell you about when we get into the data. We additionally did interviews with about 20% of everyone who we surveyed. And you can see here, I'm not going to say it all, but we had a pretty wide range of elected officials who we surveyed, from city attorneys to mayors, community college boards, school boards. Next slide, please. These are our demographics. So the lighter bar is from last year, and the darker bar is from this year. This is interesting, right? Because what it says is that across the board, there was a slight decrease in individuals reporting that they had ever been threatened or harassed. We don't know if that actually represents a decrease. It would be at odds with national data, which is saying that this phenomenon is continuing to go up. What is possible, one of our theories here, is that many people, this has become so routine and so normalized that people are internalizing it and not really recognizing that's what is happening to them is harassing behavior. The reason this is a hypothesis is because when we did interviews with elected officials, many times we would say, have you been threatened or harassed? And people would say, no, I don't think so. And then they'd say, except there was that one time I was followed to my car and people were yelling at me and blocking the way to my door, my car door. Would that be included? Yes, right? So it is possible that, again, this has become so routine that people are just answering no because it's the course of business. There might be other reasons for this. They're not huge drops, really. So many of these are not even statistically significant differences between last year and this year. Next slide, please. So when we talk about our key findings, we're looking at personal impacts, we're looking at political impacts, we're looking at implications for democratic representation, policy, and also just, do we still have faith in the systems that govern the way that we live together in society? So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. Next slide, please. I'm going to pause with some of these, so you can read it and take it in. I think it's important for people's own voices to be heard. Next slide, please. So one of the questions, is this getting worse? So the first slide was just a baseline. Have you been threatened or harassed? Yes or no, right? The slide where I said we're seeing slightly lower reporting. This is, do you think this is getting worse? Again, we're seeing about, except in the non-white category, everyone is over 50%. So in every category, more than half of our elected officials are saying yes, this phenomenon of threats and harassment is getting worse. What's interesting here is that the higher categories, white, male, conservative, rural, these are categories that last year were not getting as much threatening or harassing behavior directed towards them, and this year are reporting on a higher rate. So there's a demographic group here which our theory is starting to get more threatening and harassing behavior directed towards them. We have hypotheses about why. That again, because this has become so normalized, the more vulnerable categories of people, women and minorities, the threats and harassment targeted towards them emboldened individuals to direct this kind of behavior towards everyone. Also, again, that this is just the new normal. This is how you get business done. This is how you articulate your discontent with your local government. And so now everyone is prey, if you will. So this is something that we're continuing to look at. This does actually match national comparisons, that we're seeing more white men be on the receiving end of threats and harassment. These categories at the end are, have you considered or would you contact the police? Men are way more likely to contact the police than women, which is interesting, even though, as I'll tell you about in a moment, women are getting it way worse. But men are more likely to contact the police. Less threshold for accepting it, perhaps. And those in rural areas are about twice as likely to say they've considered leaving public service than those in urban areas. Next slide, please. This is data from our traditional media review. So what I just talked about was subjective data. This is objective data. So objectively, we're seeing a big increase in the number of media reports of threats and harassment. What gets into the media are typically the worst stories, right? Those that rise to the level of a journalist saying, hey, that's something I want to cover. But we saw a huge increase from 0 a year, 1 a year between 2017 and 2019 to between 6 and 9 stories every year. So again, our objective data matches our objective data. Next slide, please. 67% of those that we surveyed say that this has become a routine part of public service. It's normal operating procedure, right? This was pretty consistent, whether people self-reported as conservative, liberal, or moderate. Relatively consistent finding. Next slide, please. Not only are people saying this has become routine, more than half, and this is pretty concerning, say that they feel pressure to accept threatening and harassing behavior. And what do you do when you accept this behavior? You don't report it to the DA's office, right? Because this is normal. Why would you report it? So the fact that roughly half are saying that they feel like they need to accept this is pretty concerning when it comes to thinking about what are the solution sets and what are the tools at our disposal to do something about the threatening and harassing behavior. And just under half have considered leaving public service. This is hugely concerning. We should all be really, really worried about this data point. If people who want to serve their community are being pushed out because of this, and are saying, I can't take it anymore, I'm not going to put myself or my family through this anymore, who's going to fill those seats? This is a really concerning data point. Interestingly, while it's more women than men who've considered leaving public service, last year it was twice as many women as men. So there's like a balancing, there's an equalization that's happening between the genders here that's really interesting, which again, we're trying to figure out. We hope to do this research again next year, and hopefully that'll tell us a little bit more about these gender differences. Next slide, please. There's lots of impacts of threatening and harassing behavior at all levels, again, right? So roughly a quarter said they are less likely to speak out. Why say something if I'm just going to come in for abuse or attack? Especially on some of the hot button topics. These are topics DEI, CRT, used to be COVID or masking issues, COVID mandates, LGBTQ plus issues, books in libraries, etc. So if a hot button topic is on an agenda, some people, a quarter, are saying they're less likely to be vocal about their opinions on that issue. 63%, high number, are worried for their own personal safety. That's a very concerning data point. Again, you shouldn't be worried for your personal safety if you're volunteering essentially to serve on your school board. It's not a full-time job. It doesn't pay as a full-time job. It's a volunteer position. People are worried for themselves and their family. More than half of everyone who serves on a school board is worried about themselves and their safety. 6% has changed their vote. So that's a small number. In some national comparative data, that's a little higher, closer to 10%. What that means is people who are intimidating elected officials are winning. They're getting their way. They're getting elected officials, in this case just at 6%, to change their vote through threats and intimidation. That's not how democracy works. Also very concerning. It's small. It should be zero. No one should ever change their vote because they're concerned about their personal safety. Not how democracy functions. 46%. So not only are people not wanting to continue to serve at high levels, they're not suggesting public service to others, right? So I spoke to somebody who said this awful story of, I recommended public service to a woman, a female colleague, that she run for city council, I believe, not in this county. And she ran, she won, and she came in for such abuse that she now has to go to therapy 3 times a week and had a breakdown. And I will never recommend public service to anyone ever again, right? So again, who's running, who's being encouraged to run? How are the people who are currently in positions of office speaking about it to potential candidates? Also worth noting that threats and harassment occur not just once you're in office, but as you're running for office. So this is data from the California Women's List that reports 65% of women who were running or campaigning experienced harassment, and 50% of men. So it's tough to get in the door, and then once you're in the door, it remains tough. Next slide, please. This is just a national comparison of what I was just talking about. 40%, this is data from the Brennan Center, 40% of local office holders in work that they did said that abuse suppressed their willingness to engage on controversial topics. Not that they changed their vote necessarily, but I'm not going to engage in this conversation about what books should be in the library because I'm scared. I'm afraid of my personal safety. Right? So again, intimidation is not how democracy is supposed to work. Next slide, please. Really important to note that people are saying that threats and harassment aren't just coming from community members, they're coming from peers on the boards that people serve on. They're coming from their own party. So this could be the local Democratic Party, the local Republican Party, the school board that you serve on, the city council that you serve on. It's coming from all sides. And that's very concerning. There's no safe place. People are saying this used to be one-off, now it's really organized. We see the same people saying the same things at meetings all over the county. The messages that they're espousing are similar in tone and in content. And so what you do about that organization is a whole different question than what you do if it's just one individual that maybe you can prosecute as one individual. So the organization question is influential when it comes to the solutions that we need to bring to bear. And then the impacts. I mean, I just encourage you all to read this again. People are reinforcing security at their homes. They're putting in more cameras. They're changing the route that they travel. They're not going to the same grocery store. These are your neighbors who are doing all of this. Meetings get longer because you have to constantly ask people to stop shouting. People have increased anxiety, fear, isolation, loss of sleep, etc. And a sort of disengagement. One thing, if anyone has not looked at it, I encourage you all to review. The KPBS just ran a series of stories on this topic. One of them had a series of videos of people who were threatening and harassing, I think it was the county board of supervisors. And people were saying, look at me when I'm talking to you. You don't care about me. You're not hearing me. Look at me. Where's your empathy? Where's your compassion? But if you're sitting on a dais multiple times a month, being shouted at, being screamed at, you're getting death threats in your email and your social media, there are protective mechanisms that people put into place, which include putting up walls. So on the one hand, it's, I'm going to kill you. And on the other hand, it's, why aren't you looking at me and feeling empathy? That's a contradictory scenario that I think, again, we need to come to terms with. Next slide, please. That goes to this comment that we heard constantly. You have to be thick-skinned to do this work. You build up a thick skin, guess what happens? You stop listening to people. You stop having empathy for people. You stop engaging with people. So people are being told, you're just whining, you're just complaining, you have to have a thicker skin. But they're supposed to hear us. They're supposed to represent us. They're supposed to care, right? So again, this is contradictory. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk going over by a couple minutes, but I'm almost through. I'm going to talk for a second about targeting, who's getting this the worst. Next slide, please. So women have reported this year in aggregate receiving threats or harassment at a similar level to men. So this question, have you ever been threatened or harassed? Women and men answer at about the same level. 66% to 69%. Do you experience threats or harassment more than weekly? Women report yes 3 times as often as their male counterparts. So women are getting this way more frequently, is what that means, than their male counterparts. Again, men way more likely to call the police, even though they're getting less of it. And I already talked about considering leaving public service. Interestingly here, men say that this vitriol makes them more likely to speak out. Women say it makes them less vocal. And women also, even though that they are less likely to call police, support higher penalties through the legal system. Next slide, please. So again, that was our subjective data. We wanted to compare this more objectively to make sure that it, if people said, well, women just feel different than men, women are softer, women aren't as tough, because we anticipated that some people might think that or say that. So we ran a couple scenarios to try to see if men and women answered these questions differently, and that would give an indication that men and women had different thresholds, right, for what constitutes a threat. No difference. No difference across the genders. So from that, it seems like men and women think of threats in a similar way. Next slide, please. The other objective data collection method that we used was social media review from Twitter. Was Twitter at the time, so I'm still saying it. We pulled over almost 500,000 tweets. The big takeaway from this, I won't go into all the details, is that women receive almost 4 times as many aggressive, controlling tweets as their male counterparts. When you control for how often they tweet, the prominence of their office, where they serve. It's just flat, women are getting this way more. So our objective and our subjective data matches. Next slide, please. So for us, what are we doing next? We're having these community conversations. Thank you all for showing up in the middle of the week on a warm evening. This is really where our solutions come from. So the work that you all do at the tables will make it into our final report. The solutions that will go in there will be co-created with community, as well as pulled from expert analysis from around the country. We will have our final report out this fall. If you left your name and your email, you will get a copy of it. We'll disseminate it to everyone, hopefully, who is here tonight. And then we're just going to keep working on this. We hope to expand further up in Southern California. Orange County, LA County are behemoths when it comes to this topic. Our goal is all of California. So stay tuned for that. We're just looking for financing for that. But next slide, please. What we're going to do now is come up with solutions. So next slide, please. Because people told us at the rate of 83%, those we interviewed again, that threats and harassment are a major issue that require a public response. You're the public. You're going to figure out what that response is. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you, just go to the next one, actually. No, on the next one, sorry. I'm going to show you what people came up with last year. So that's on the left-hand side of the screen. These are the recommendations that made it into our report last year. That again were drawn from these community conversations. So those of you who came to Encinitas, you might recognize some of these, as well as some expert analysis of the issue. Then you'll also see recommendations from public elected officials themselves on the right-hand side of the screen. So take a look at these. Don't be overly influenced by them. It's a good reference point. Are these right? What are they missing? Are there more that should be there? Should some of these go away? Those are the kinds of questions that we want you to work on in the next portion of the agenda, which my colleague Daniel Orth from the National Conflict Resolution Center will facilitate with his colleague Natalia. Thank you so much for listening to all of the data. I know it's heavy. I know there's a lot. I'm happy to answer any questions after the table conversations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to everyone who's here. Yeah, I am Daniel Orth, the Associate Director of the National Conflict Resolution Center. I'm really pleased to continue the partnership on this work together that we started last year. That quote, "The overall political landscape of America is playing out at your local school board." I spent the day prior to coming here working with an entire district staff, principals and assistant principals from a local school district because of the kind of othering and the threats and the violence that they're experiencing, and so we were there supporting them. So that quote really resonates with the kind of work that we're doing. I liked what Stephen said. Just because it's legal doesn't mean we should tolerate it, right? And I think the impacts that Rachel described for how these threats and harassment are affecting our society, our neighbors, our democracy, compels us to do more. And the point when you said about, people not reporting, right, what has become normal, I just wanted to share something with you that I think is very tragic. We've been doing a ton of work with parks and rec facilities across the country, and one of the things that we've heard from multiple agencies, parks and recreation agencies, is their staff don't know what is normal anymore. They have teenagers refereeing basketball games and soccer games who get spit on by parents, and they're not sure if that's acceptable or not. And that's the level that things are getting to at this point, that a grown person would spit on a child for making a bad call, right? And so when you said that about not being reported, what is becoming normal, it struck me. At NCRC, we don't think that's normal, and we think that we can do better. And we believe that disagreeing respectfully and constructively, even around very contentious, important, divisive issues, is possible, and it's the only way that we have a functioning society and a functioning democracy. And so at NCRC, we do a couple of things that I think supports that by training folks to give them the skills to be able to have those difficult yet respectful conversations, by creating spaces in which those conversations can happen, and by helping to facilitate those conversations, which is what we're here for tonight. So I'm really fortunate to be joined by my colleague, Natalie. What we're going to do now is invite you all at your tables. And for those of you who are at a smaller table, if you want to stay together, that's totally fine. If you want to kind of join up with some other folks to have some bigger conversations, I won't compel anyone, but feel free. We're going to invite you to reflect on those three pieces that Rachel actually put out there, right? Are these recommendations right? What's missing? And what more do we need, right? Are these right? What's missing here? Or what's missing from these? And are there more recommendations potentially too? And if I could ask every table to designate the person with the best handwriting to serve as a scribe with those notepads and pens that are there, as you all are discussing the recommendations, just jot down some notes for us, please, in your most legible handwriting for the team working on this. And then when we come back together here, we're going to invite each table to share one or two of the most interesting, thought-provoking, exciting recommendations that they've come up with. And Natalie and I are going to be kind of floating around and mixing in with the different groups. So please go ahead, and we'll come back together in probably about 15 minutes or so.
I think the boards need to get together and start working with the law and how they can, deal with this problem.
Right. Now my son has to kick people out of school. So.
Their speaker and that recommendation that they feel like is really important, exciting, new. Yes, Chris? All right.
No, I like the one. That's innovative.
I know it's dangerous with great power and mighty words.
Not much power. Our board's reporting these threats and harassments to the DA. So we have someone at our group who is a League of Women Voters observer, who has seen meetings where people are doing this kind of behavior all the time. So are they reporting it? Because there is a possibility these people are going from one elected official meeting to another, and every time they're looking for attention. I don't know what they're looking for, we're not exactly sure. But we're not reporting it, we're not telling anyone. And one of the and someone said, well, are they really threatening? Well, we should hang you, was that it? You should be hung. I mean, that's a threat. That's unpleasant.
And that's great bodily harm.
And we decided that was bodily harm. The other thing was to use the Brown Act, possibly by reviewing parts at the beginning and then trying to hold the line. Thank you, Daniel.
You're welcome. Thank you, Chris, and your table. And so that sounds like part of like the supporting the reporting, the documentation of the threats, and make sure they're getting into the proper avenues of the DA's office. I'm sure Stephen would like that. Carol?
Thank you. We had lots of ideas. I think lots of people didn't realize how the extent of problems that are in the different city councils and events there are. The one thing that solution that we came up with was to have speakers that come to city councils or whoever to sign a code of conduct. And whether it be enforceable or not is really not the point. I think it might be useful for education purposes, as just to let everybody know that they have to have a certain code of conduct.
I like it. I'm voting for that.
All right. Anne's on board. Yeah, so posting those, also helping to educate folks about the scope and the severity of the issue, I think is an important part of what's happening right here tonight. Who's up?
We thought when there's something up for a vote, say taxes, or something that you know that your community, it's a hot ticket item, hot button item, that you hold a special meeting so that you can put aside 2 hours or 3 hours to hear what everybody has to say and deal with that one issue, as opposed to putting it in the agenda and then having the rest of the meeting hijacked. We thought that might help. Also, we found in Carlsbad, we talked a lot about how in Carlsbad, around the walls of the city council, there's a saying about civil discourse and how that's encouraged. And I don't know how often they point out to it.
I think that might be NCRC's Code of Civil Discourse, which we're going to pass out to everybody here in just a moment. So, but I like that idea of anticipating sort of flashpoints and kind of creating specific opportunities for those more divisive, hot conversations to happen, to then allow space for other conversations to take place.
It's actually piggybacking. Is it Chris?
Yes.
Yes. So our group also had several ideas, and Mona suggested inviting the League of Women Voters or any impartial observers to witness and also catalog the insults and the threats. So sort of reporting to the DA, but cataloging them so that after a certain number of points, those people might not be allowed back to the meeting. I don't know the legalities of that, but that was just, that seems to be something that's a common idea here. So, where are you?
Thank you, Janice. Yeah, so Stephen, you got a lot of volunteers here tonight, I think. So it's like when you speed, right? You get points in your license, and they take your driver's license away with enough violations, then they take away your public speaking license.
Good evening. I was very lucky to have a great group, so we have a lot of ideas that I do want to share afterwards, but we did pick one in the interest of time. I think we've mainly focused on number 1, 2, and 6. So we really talked about the anonymity that folks get when they threaten these folks that are in elected positions. And so what we talked about was documentation. So it's kind of along the lines of some of the things that others have mentioned, some kind of list, whether we call it a watch list, an alert list, something like that. And the idea would be that when these folks are threatening officials, even if they feel that they're anonymous, they're not. So we're going to be tracking that and allowing the law enforcement to hopefully intervene before it escalates.
The list of incivility shame. We hit everybody, right? Yes? Okay. Great recommendations. As I said, our goal here tonight was to get all this feedback from you all, collect this in these notes, feed it into the team, process that to form then part of the report with additional recommendations coming out later on. As I mentioned, number 1 on the right-hand side there, codes of conduct, consequences. NCRC developed this Code of Civil Discourse at the request of a number of local elected agencies and bodies, and they've got it posted and they're using it and they found it very effective. And so I think having this as a tool to refer back to and reference, they have found to be effective. And so I think the City Council of San Diego is currently considering it. I think they have it for themselves, but not the public yet. So interesting ways that they're trying to adapt things like this Code of Civil Discourse to help to try to moderate the conversation there. I'm going to turn things back over to Rachel to close things out and talk about, I can't not call on Nejla. Go ahead, Nejla.
So sorry. I have a question for Rachel and the team based on something that emerged at our table, because one of our colleagues said that there's a group of frequent flyers who tend to go to these meetings, are agitators in a sense. In your research here in San Diego, but also in comparison at the national level, do you think that the source of these problems are local or national? Because if it is national, then the strategies have to be very different than local. So if you can enlighten us.
That's a beautiful segue. A question for Rachel. I'll give her back the microphone.
Thanks, Daniel. Big thank you to Daniel for helping facilitate those table conversations. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for the work that you did. People sometimes come to these events not thinking that they're going to be put to work. So we appreciate you accepting that. The answer, Nejla, is yes and, like both and. So there are definitely groups of individuals who we and others of various different agencies have tracked, who will show up at a city council meeting in Oceanside, in San Marcos, in Escondido. So they're not necessarily residents or constituents of the one place that they're going. They're roaming around, if you will, to try to get particular policies pushed, viewpoints, etc. So there is definitely a local organization that's happening, and that's documented and being watched, I should say, by various different organizations. There is also a narrative that is being used, that is inspired nationally, at state levels, and at local levels. And there's a range of different narratives, right? So it could be, somebody in one of the interviews said, if I hear something on Joe Rogan, I think was the example that he used, I'm gonna hear it in my city council meeting. Like if there's something that's being talked about on talk radio or in a national discourse, that's again, a hot button, a contentious issue, I'm gonna hear about it in my local meeting. So there is a contagion, if you will, right, of grievances that are circulating in the air, and they circulate from national to local, local to national. There's also very much a reality that, and this quote, right, that the polarization that we're facing nationally is playing out at your local school board meetings, right? That is a connective tissue quote. But there is a big sense, and we heard this a lot from school board members in particular, that so much of what people are aggrieved about has nothing to do with what the school board itself can do anything about. They're aggrieved about decisions that are happening in Sacramento, decisions that are being made by the California State Legislature, the governor's office, but that's very far away, and their school board meeting is right down the street, and it happens every 2 weeks. So it's national, it's state, it's local also, and it circulates among them. And social media helps that. The ease of communicating with people across distance helps that. Violi, my colleague in the back, is working actually right now on a stakeholder map that we hope to include in the final report, which will put a little bit more detail into this, we hope. But not as much as people want, probably, because it's hard to track, but we'll keep looking into it. I saw your hand. We're over time. I would love you all to stay. We are happy, I think, to stay and be in dialogue, but if anyone does need to leave, don't feel bad. We won't look at you funny. Susan, please.
Yeah. Quick observation. A lot of this is about threats and attacks on elected. We've been talking mostly about threats and harassment to elected officials, but what's complicating all of this is the fact that in many cases the threats and harassment are coming from elected officials.
Mic drop. Yes, we heard that many, many times. We referenced it on one of our slides where people are saying it's coming from all sides, right? So it's not just coming from the public, it's coming from the person who I sit next to on the dais, who's on my city council, who I share a role with. And going back to the solution sets, many of the proposed solutions, most of them, I would say, actually, are about what you do with the public, not how you mitigate this when it's coming from your peers. And then there's also a lot of sense from some that it's coming not just from peers on school boards or city councils or other electeds, but again, from the party infrastructure that people are running. And we've heard that in particular from women, that they're facing a degree of harassment from within the party that should be supporting them and holding them up and boosting them. So absolutely.
So Rachel, all this research is being done and we're finding out these god-awful things are happening everywhere. You know, that's really awful. But what's important, I think, from all of the research is what's the real impact on our functioning as a society. So what are you guys doing about that?
What are you doing about that?
I just found out about it, right? I've been working on it a long time.
Fair enough. I mean, for us, educating ourselves and others was goal number one, right? So you don't know what to do about a problem until you understand the problem. And we initiated this work because we knew there was this increase in polarization, vitriol, fragmentation, nationally, internationally. This is also quite a problem, and if anyone's been looking at what's happening in Mexico and local elections in Mexico, 50 times worse than what we're seeing here, with very lethal outcomes. And so we really wanted to understand what's the scope here in Southern California, starting in San Diego. So again, we can't recommend anything until we understand what's happening. Part of why we do these conversations in partnership with the DA's office, with the Burnham Center, with NCRC, with others who've come to other community conversations with the League of Women Voters, is because it's not up to us. It's up to us, right? And I think we were having a sidebar conversation with Tad before he left about just how important it is for people of goodwill to say something. It's like this, I lived in New York for a very long time, still what I consider home, that the like see something, say something adage applies here, right? So if everyone's sitting in a public meeting and somebody is threatening an official in front of 200 other people and no one's doing anything about it, that's normalizing that behavior. So it's something we all have to do something about, and if we don't know, was it you that said, if we don't know the scale of the problem, which I can say at every community conversation we've had, people were like, I had no idea it was this bad. So if you don't know the scale of the problem, you don't know how important it is to say something. And now that we all know the scale of the problem, we're all a little bit better armed to do something about it. And I can tell you the final thing here, I think this is fair to say from the perspective of the elected officials that we spoke to, how isolated they feel and how much they feel that they have to bear the burden of this on their shoulders because no one's doing anything about it. Because it's normalized, because they're being told, have a thicker skin, toughen up, this is part of the job, didn't you know you were gonna get this? So they're like, okay, I guess this is what I just have to bear this burden. And we have to change that narrative. We have to say, this is not okay, we as a community don't accept it, we're gonna stand up and we're gonna defend you and we're gonna say this isn't okay. So that's what we're doing.
We could have an elected official appreciation day.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, really.
That's a great idea.
I don't think people understand how hard elected officials work.
I agree. We'll put it in the recommendations, honestly. I mean, there probably is a day, because there's a day for like, you know, long hair day. There's a day for everything, but that is a wonderful idea. I love it. Yeah. Any other?
Stephen, can I ask you a question? It's something that came up at our table. It wouldn't be your office, but for instance, like in the city of San Diego, in the city council, is there someone dedicated to addressing this challenge kind of holistically? Like, is there, because Rachel just said like elected officials feel like I have to deal with it, I have to go home and deal with this. Is there anyone in like these governments that are like dedicated to say like, okay, I'm handling this from the way we're going to organize meetings to the way I'm going to offer you support to the way I'm going to, report to you because I know how to do that and I have the relationship.
That's part of the reason why collaboration is so important, because there are different organizations approaching this from different fronts. So yes, in our office, obviously we receive complaints that are delivered to us by the police, or maybe an official will call us, or we'll receive wind of something and investigate it. But that's just one aspect. If somebody else is going and observing meetings and seeing what's happening and seeing that somebody is continuously harassing different elected officials around town and just keeping a notebook, that's in isolation. So that's why it's important that, as you see, we have different groups talking, you have law enforcement involved, and it's only through that whole collective force that we can really, one, understand the scope of it, and two, figure out what to do about it. And on top of that comes in the rest of society, right? And that's why I think it's so critical that people do take that approach, obviously with safety in mind. If you see somebody who is going off the deep end, I'm not advocating anybody intervene and put yourself at risk, but it is important that we take care of each other, and so that's on a very day-to-day level, but it's also amongst organizations. So yes, there are groups in my office, in other offices, but we have to constantly be in communication with each other, so we're not just repeating the work or just having a fragment of the solution.
As a citizen, when something happens in our community, the first thing that we do is we reach out to the police.
Absolutely.
But we had a situation where they were coming out every week. And is there a direct communication with the district attorney's office that we could have gone to you when, this happened for over a 2-year process?
What I sometimes recommend, let me understand, did you feel like you were not getting any sort of action?
It's a horrible situation. This elderly man kept exposing himself to kids and women in the neighborhood, and so we would call the police and they would come out, and it's awful. And then they would bring in community health specialists, but he was doing it for years.
So sometimes what I recommend in any situation, so this obviously applies to a threatening situation or what you encountered, is that when the police do respond, it's your right to hold your public servants accountable as well. So I always recommend people ask for the officer's name, ask for the number that's going to be assigned to that incident, and let them know that you're going to be following up. So what number can you have to follow up in a few days and find out what's happened with that situation? And so and that requires maybe a little bit more work on that end.
Well, we did all that.
But once you've done that, then yes, you could contact the district attorney's office.
So we ended up having to hire an attorney
Right.
to file a complaint against the family to get him to stop. But the police, you can understand they're overwhelmed. They don't want to take an elderly man to jail, but they had to several times. And the community healthcare people, nobody really wants to deal with it.
If there is an ongoing situation and you feel that there is a criminal aspect or something where the district attorney's office may be able to help, the only way we can figure out if we can help out is if you reach out to us. So yes, I would invite that.
You got a card on you?
What's that? I do, and I will give you one afterwards. Absolutely. And I would encourage that, whether it's calling a general line and letting somebody know what the general topic is, and saying you need to talk to somebody about something you want to follow up. And like I said, Victim services are so central to what we do, and making sure that people in the community feel safe. And so even if maybe we can't, like I said, file a case against an individual, there are so many other things that we do. We work in collaboration with organizations, with support groups, Neighborhood Watch, and there's so many different things we can do. So yes, I would encourage you to reach out. And I will give you a card afterwards.
Thanks so much. I'm looking around, I'm not seeing anything else. I have to say, this is the first group that has stayed this long after with questions. So you're the most engaged group. Thank you. Thank you all again so much for coming. Get a card from Steven if you like. I don't have any cards, but I'm happy to share my email, my phone. We can make the slides available if anyone is interested. Daniel has more of the codes of conduct. If you would like any more of those, contact NCRC. And I am going to see if you would like, Miriam, if you would like to say any final concluding remarks. No, you wouldn't. Okay. Take some snacks with you. We have a lot. We don't carry them to the car, so please feel free to take some grandma's cookies or some trail mix. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it.